Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. My name is Jasper Oorthuis and I'm here with Murray Dahm, who is the assistant editor for Ancient Warfare magazine. And in between our busy work trying to get the magazine out, we are answering your questions. Today, we're answering Cosma's question, and which was, how were mercenaries recruited in the ancient world? Murray.
Well, the short answer is lots of different ways for mercenaries to be recruited. The biggest issue we've got, of course, is when do mercenaries become a thing, and that tends to get pushed earlier and earlier. That there are evidence of mercenaries in a very early period in ancient warfare, and then you've got the issue of, but were they really, or were they, the fighting unit of a conquered people? In which case, your hiring was, come and fight for us or else. So that probably actually that caters for some and continues to do so. The submission of a people basically reliant upon fighting for the conqueror. That goes all the way through to the late Roman Empire, where the Goths crossed the Danube based on the promise that they will fight for the Roman Empire. So that's one. The second one, of course, is a commander who basically goes out and finds mercenaries, going from city to city and hiring mercenaries, generally in return for cash, and saying, "Come and fight for me, and I'll take you on a journey of plunder and excitement." Probably the best example of that is the Anabasis of Xenophon, where we get great descriptions of masses of different mercenaries being hired by individual commanders such as Proxenos, who was Xenophon's friend, and then he goes to join Clearchus the Spartan, and they then join Tissaphernes, and they've all kind of hired themselves to a commander who's under Clearchus, who's under Tissaphernes, who of course is basically dissimulating, because then Tissaphernes has a plan to try and take the throne of Persia, and all of these mercenaries didn't sign up for that. So there's all of those sorts of things, which again is really interesting, and we did it in the last magazine, where we looked at the sort of terms of some of the mercenary agreements, which we've got surviving in one contract, where they've actually got some quite niggly little, you won't have us for longer than 2 years. You won't be able to do these things that we don't want to do. You'll have a retirement plan. If one of us dies on campaign, you'll look after our family and our wives, which is a quite very forward thinking for a mercenary contract in the 3rd century BC. So there's those individual commanders hiring groups, and that again, that continues all the way through the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors have is it a mercenary band of German bodyguards? It looks like it is. They seem to be extra outside the normal legionary Praetorian Guard kind of enrollment. So again, that's sort of very hard to know. The other one you've got, of course, is things like at Athens, you've got when they have the 4 corps at Athens after the Persian Wars. So you've got the Navy, which we know all about. We've got the hoplites, which we know all about. You've got the cavalry, which we know all about. And you've also got the archers. Now, the archers are interesting because, of course, stereotypically in Greek warfare, archers are regarded as cowardly, and yet virtually every army has archers somewhere. Not always mentioned, but they are there. And at Athens, for instance, they hire Scythians, the 300 Scythian archers, who are like a local police force, which is very peculiar. They also hire barbarians to be their archers as well. And they also hire metics and Cretans to be part of their archer corps. And like the history of Cretan mercenaries goes all the way from the 5th century BC in the Peloponnesian War, perhaps even earlier, all the way through to the Roman Empire, when you get cohorts of Cretan archers, which we'll get to in a second about, are they actually Cretans? We'll get to that. So that's the sort of the next lot is city states hiring people and paying them rather than individual commanders. You then have the issue of what are called simachoi. So there are cities, for instance, on Crete and in the Greek states as well, where the city agrees to provide a commander or another city with a group of mercenaries for a given set of time, and generally a given number of mercenaries. Now, that's really interesting because it looks like they agree to give 200 mercenaries to a commander for 2 years, for instance. And if there are casualties in those 200, the city that's hiring out its citizens has been paid for 200 mercenaries for 2 years. So the city's responsibility is to replace those casualties with more men to replace the ones who've died, which is a really interesting sort of contract agreement. What's also interesting is clearly those cities were also doing a bit of a dodge, because they were going, yeah, we'll just get 200 blokes in and then we'll shove them off. So these surviving contract inscriptions, where we have them, actually specify that 50% of those agreed mercenaries must be citizens of that city. So you couldn't just grab any old bloke and put them into the field. So clearly, I mean, that clause implies that there were people hiring bad mercenaries, trying to play the system. So those Simokoy agreements are really interesting, because you've got mercenaries being hired all over the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, essentially hired out from their city, their home city, and they've been paid for in advance. And so the city has got the income, and they've then signed up. We get some who have gone to Syracuse, and then so there's lots of the epigrams of Callimachus, for instance, in the Greek anthology. There's mercenaries who've dedicated their weapons in Syracuse, in Ortygia, and then they move to Alexandria, where they hire themselves out again. So it's a mercenary life. And that, again, that goes all the way back to the 7th century. There's Greek lyric, which is talking about, being a mercenary fighting on the conquest of Thasos and these other cities. So it's an amazingly long period. So that's Simokoy agreements. Then you have agents, where a commander or a general or a ruler would hire an agent to go and hire them mercenaries in a particular city. So again, we have evidence that Mithridates V, for instance, had paid for a vast number of Thracians for a very long period of time, where he could basically just use it as a recruiting ground. And so they have agents who would go around and make these agreements on behalf of the ruler. So that's those. And then you've got, the Numidian horsemen under Massinissa and things like that. Are they allies or are they mercenaries? They're a kind of vague sort of agreement, because again, what you've got with Caesar is Caesar's using Numidian horsemen in the conquest of Gaul, and that clearly isn't an ally relationship. It must be some kind of mercenary relationship. We don't know much about the Carthaginian hiring practices. We know they had a very sort of massively mercenary army. We don't know whether it was under one of these sorts of agreements. Probably Hannibal is making negotiations with chieftains and cities to provide him with troops in order to go and campaign for X amount of years. Probably not for 15, which it ends up being, but we don't know how they swap out, for instance. Obviously, one of the things you can appeal to mercenaries with is plunder, that they're going to augment their pay. But what these things show is that a lot of them are actually paid in advance, and then they are paid sort of a stipend on the job. But the city, especially that's hired them on their behalf, they get the lump sum in advance, which is fascinating and complicated. And if I got them all, we've got cities, Simokoy, agents, and commanders. Yep. So that's a sort of a very, very brief overview of all
what
the
about
different
individuals?
ranks.
Where do they come in?
I think individuals can become part of any one of those. So, like in these Greek Simokoy agreements, these Cretan Simokoy agreements, you could make your way to Crete and sign up to be another one of these mercenaries from that city. And of course, obviously, the Peloponnese becomes a massive recruitment zone after the Peloponnesian War in the 4th century BC, where there's lots of men, soldiers who've got equipment waiting to be hired. So I think that there's probably, you can just see the recruitment desk of some of these people who are just like signing up soldiers, knowing that they're going to be hired out. And I'll give you a Lokoi, I'll give you a Mora of Spartan trained hoplites or Peloponnesian hoplites, or I think those sorts of entities exist. It's just we really lose track of them, other than in the vaguest terms.
And what role does the famous cape on the southern tip of?
That's what I meant. That's what I meant
Yeah.
when I said Peloponnese, because it's begins with T. Go on, brain. And I want to say Taurion. No. Anyway,
No.
it's a cape. It's a cape at the south of
Somebody's
the Peloponnese.
shouting at the
yes, they
podcast.
are. Sorry to those of you shouting at your screens right now. We know the one. We just can't put our finger on the name. And I think that's the same thing, is that because of the traffic that would go past it, sea traffic, that's the perfect place to,
So that's where agents go, probably, or
agents. But also, I think it would also be a destination to know that you could be hired from there.
yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
So yeah, that's
Cosma,
in a nutshell.
I hope that answers the question, at least somewhat for you.
Yes. Yes.
We'll speak again soon. Bye.